Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I thought you could
Hi.
start out by introducing yourself.
Yes, I'm Kristine Holm-Jensen, and I'm working at the Textile Museum in Herning. And originally I studied European ethnology, so I'm working a lot with the cultural history in this area. And especially I've been working with the textile industry in the 20th century, but also with the roots tracing back in time, because it's like 400 years that we've been working with textiles here in this area.
Very cool. And actually, what we're mainly going to start out focusing on today is the hosiery business back in like the 16th, 17th century, and what role the hosier played. So if maybe you could talk a bit about that. And I think most people probably know of these words. In Danish, it's hosekræmmer, because of the famous novel here we have written by someone called Stine Linnemann. And I think it's become very much, his novel has become the way that most people see this term, popular culture. But if you could tell us a bit about it, like historically and...
It's actually the local manor house in 1630s, around that time, that they start making a specialized production in a way when they'll take some new sheep to this area, and they will try to improve the wool from the sheep, and furthermore they'll have people working for them. It's the local farmers. Instead of paying the rent with different kind of crops, they'll pay it with woolen socks, for example. So it's a production that takes place in the farmhouses, where the local farmers they'll sit and knit all together, and that's where Stine Linnemann gets his stories. That's from people gathering around these long tables in the farmhouses. In Danish, we're calling it the bindestue. It's because you're meeting in the living room and you'll sit and knit. So the production is in the farmhouses, and they have local wool, and it's the manor house taking care of getting new kind of sheep to the area, so they get a better product for selling. And then it's very fast. It get a part of the local economy. So you can kind of swap your rent for some knitted socks, and we see it in the contracts that they are writing at that time. They will also mention how many socks you have to pay with every year. So it's very it's really it's very early that it's very important for the economy in this area that we have this production. And the manor house, they take care of, on one hand, getting the right kind of sheep to the area with the good wool, and on the other hand, they are collecting the woolen products, and they will send it off to people selling it in different kinds of Denmark, or a different part of Denmark. So they are kind of distributing it to the consumers.
So that way the whole production chain is really taken care of. But nowadays, when we think about knitting, at least in Nordic countries and in Western civilization, it's often seen as more of a woman's work type of thing. Was that also the case at this time?
No, at this time it's everybody's knitting. So you start off when you're like 5 years old, and it's almost on the day when you're hitting the ground, then you'll stop knitting. So it's from the start of your life to the end of your life. And then it's a kind of, you're learning it step by step. So in the beginning, the children, they already knit the easy parts of the stockings, for example, and then they have grown-ups, they are knitting the heel, etc., the more complicated parts. And then it's getting it's part of your everyday life. So whenever you go somewhere, you will have your yarn on the shoulder and the knitting in your hand, and then you'll just walk. And there's a lot of time and space for walking because the area is heather. So you have very huge area with no buildings, no farmhouses, And also that's also why a lot of people say that we have this kind of early production in this area, because the ground is very unfertile. So it's very difficult to grow normal kind of crops like barley and oat and the things that you usually will have for a farmhouse to live. You can't get that, so instead you'll have sheep, because they can easily find something to eat in the heather. So that's also if you are looking for some explanations to why it come up, then it's also because the ground is very unfertile.
Yeah, so specifically in this area, it was bigger. So I guess it was like the thing that you probably had an identity as a farmer, but then because it was so hard to be a farmer who actually had enough produce in this area, then the knitting became quite a big, what would you call it, partial part of the economy.
Yeah, you could say that.
But it wasn't the primary thing. It was always like an extra thing still,
exactly.
Right?
That was a way of making your household come through the winter. For example, you could knit and then you could sell it, or you could use it for rent for the local manor, so you could make a living for your life, so or your family. So it has been it's not the most important thing, but it was very important for the farmers to live in this area. And also there's actually during sometimes there are some people coming to this area, and they're not satisfied with people knitting so much, because they say they are abandoning their farming because they're knitting because they can earn money from that. But I think in overall it was mostly farmers, and then they were also knitting as an extra income for the house.
Yeah, because I guess you could have sort of imagined the reality where then the knitting took over and became the larger part, but the farming was still always the main thing.
Yes,
so it was very much the identity of the people in the area.
Yeah.
But I think it's really fascinating how you're saying it could actually be part of paying the rent. Just imagining these contracts with socks on them. That's quite
exactly. That's very
funny to try and imagine nowadays. Also, as an independent textile designer, is one of those jokes I make sometimes. Like, like I can pay my rent with things that I make. Well, once upon a time you could. Apparently.
You could actually, because it was a different kind of economy.
Yeah,
so you could also pay with crops and other kind of
and it was
products.
also before industrialization, so there was no other way to produce these socks, so their value was bigger in that way.
Exactly.
And that kind of leads me to the next question, like how did this tradition die out now when the industrialization came? Because I know Herning is very much the area in Denmark where the textile industrialization came to in a big way, and I imagine it changed the area quite a bit when that happened.
We have a period in the 18th century where it's not declining, but it's changing. So it's not the big farms. They are more and more just having farms or just farmers, and then it's the small people living in small cottages and houses. They start being the main producers, and then it's not the manor house taking care of the distribution anymore, it's the big farmhouses. It's that's the story that Stine Linnemann is telling us about in hosekræmmer. So we have this transition time, but then when we come to like it's around 1870, then we have this wave of industrialization coming through Denmark, and it also reaches this area. So we have some of these small people living in cottages. They'll buy a machine, and they will have it still in the farmhouse. They will have the machine, and they will sit and do some knitting. So that's the first small steps, but very important to us is infrastructure. And in 1877, we have the railroad coming from Aarhus in east and heading for Ringkøbing in west, and it had to stop somewhere. So they made a stop in Herning, and also in Ikast and Hammerum, which is also very important textile towns or cities in this area. And then with the railroad, we had a complete transition of the the production in this area. So that you could say that's the industrialization taking place during that time.
Is that because then that made the movement of materials and machines easier?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And also you could have the machines because before that, it's very difficult to imagine, but the roads, they were actually just a path through the heath. So it's really difficult to take heavy machines to this area. So when you had the railroad, you could transport the machines to this area much more easily. And
Makes
also, and also it was very important with the railroad that you could have new kinds of raw material. So this is also the period when they stop doing products in wool, and instead we have a new material that's cotton. So we have a lot of cotton coming from Egypt and where other places where they produced cotton.
And maybe India at that time as well, because the UK was in charge of the...
But the thing is, now we have the railroad system, so you can easily attach to that. You could put it on your on a boat in Egypt, and you could sail it through the Mediterranean, and then on a rail, the railroads will take it straight to Hammerum. We have this very a nice box that says from Egypt to Hammerum, which is this little
in the
town.
museum.
Yeah, in the museum, and that was Egyptian cotton in this box. So we have a change in machines, and we have a change in raw materials. So that was very important.
Yeah, but the technique remains the same, right? It's always been knitting that's been a focus of this area. I found that quite interesting because I trained as a weaver and I studied in the UK. And when you talked about the industrialization there, it was always about weaving looms. And I think I just kind of had that so much ingrained in my perception of industrialization. So when I first came to Herning to study this subject, I was a bit surprised by the fact that it was so through and through the knitting. But it really makes sense when you look at it in this historical perspective. It really started practically from the hand knitting. So even though that's really not related to how you knit on machines very much, that it evolved this way.
Yeah, but I think it's very important that you're not only going to focus on the technique, it's also the network that you have to your consumers, because your consumers were used to knitted products, and then you're just attaching your industry to this consumer network. And that's in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why that the knitting remained so strong in this area, is that you have this network of production and the materials and the techniques, and then you have the consumer network, and that's based on knitted products. So to me it makes sense that then instead of having woolen underwear, then you'll have some knitted underwear. And still you can see some of the products, like the long underwear trousers for men. You can see you have it in a hand knitted woolen version, and then you have it in a machine knitted cotton version. So I think that's very important to remember the consumer and the network for consuming.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it's also very much a reflection of some of the differences between Denmark and the UK, where as far as I know, in the UK, it was very much the silk jacquard production that was a big part of the industrialization. And that's very much like an upper class sort of thing. I think Denmark has always had more of a really big kind of working class and farmer class. So they wouldn't kind of go for this luxury product, but they more need the everyday product. The UK is such a big place with such a big upper class that you have more of a market for that.
Yeah, exactly. It's been through from the 1870s and then until after the Second World War, the industrial products they were mainly basic wear, like underwear and socks and shirts and trousers for working. So it makes a lot of sense that it was this everyday products, and they are very it's very appropriate to make it in knitted products.
So if you look at the hosiery business in present time, I know there's still a little bit of industrial production in Herning, but not a huge amount. It's really just very few places. But how about the more traditional hand knit tradition? Does it still exist? Is it something that you do as like a special sort of hobby in the area because it's a historical thing, a bit like you see in Norway, the traditional outfits are really popular, but in Denmark for some reason they're not. Sometimes you have these little areas where they still are into specific things.
No, not at all. There's no special hand knitting tradition in this area. No. I think I've been thinking a little bit about because it was male work, working with a knitting machine was male work, and for primarily men. And when you talk to them, it's not about knitting exactly. It's more about the technique. It's not about materials. It's more about the machine, making the machine work well. So, and also I did a little survey about the transition from hand knitting to industry, because I had this idea that it's most probably it was people with a strong tradition of knitting who started having their own factories or started working with the knitting machines. But I actually realized that it was only, I think, I spoke to 30 or 40 men who had worked with knitting machines, and I only had one person saying, "Oh yes, my family had this tradition of hand knitting." So it's more a story.
So there was a shift in who was the production. It moved to different families.
Yeah. It was more a question of this area going from being rural to being an urban society. So they didn't have these. There was not this long tradition of knitting just turning into hand knitting, turning into machine knitting. It was more a question of how can I get a job, because I don't want to work in the farm anymore, because there was after the Second World War we had different kind of machines coming to the farms, and they didn't need a lot of people working for them anymore. So there was a huge amount of people that were looking for a job. So
the jobs in farming disappeared, and then they moved to the textile industry.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's more the story than a hand knitting tradition turning into a machine knitting. Yeah.
Right. I noticed though that I stumbled upon this little sort of, I'm not sure what the right English name for it. I don't think it's a guild. It's sort of more like a sort of business club, and it's only for men. And I think the name is hosekræmmer.
Exactly,
so it's like this guild of people doing hosiery, but what it is it's people who are business people, has nothing really to do with textiles. But I think it's because it's a Herning-based club, so they're kind of taking the idea from the area, but then it's not related to textiles. It's all, as far as I understand, but they have these funny little red hats they all wear when they're meeting.
Yeah.
Kind of cute.
That's
and they
also
still
about
have the knitting. Things for
some
of the traditions they pass over.
Yeah. But that's also consumption. This guild, or hosekræmmer, was started in I think it's in 1952, and that's when they started having textile fairs just after the Second World War, because people they didn't have much faith in Danish production and Danish products. So they came up with these textile fairs where they invited consumers to come and have a look on all the nice stuff that we can do in this area. And then to get some journalists writing about it, they made this hosekræmmer, or this guild, as just a media stunt. Yeah, it was a media stunt from the beginning. It was always only meant to be one day, and then they realized, that was kind of funny.
Yeah.
So it's still there, but it's more like a business network today.
Yeah, I was just really surprised when I found it, because you have these really serious looking men, and it's this kind of thing where it's I think it's very few things in Denmark that you still have so gender divided. So you're not allowed in as a woman.
No.
And then this combination of how serious they are about it all, and then all these little hats that kind of make them look like Christmas elves. I just think it's a really interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. But it is it is just that they're meeting once a year, and then they'll have new members, and they'll go to visit a company, and they'll have something nice to eat. So that's
it's like a business network thing. So they know each other, and they're brothers, or whatever you call it in this institution.
So so it's not because there's a long tradition that they are building on. No.
See, the last question that I have is around the fact that Herning has very much, as we've talked about, been the textile center of Copenhagen, and that's also, I'm sure, why the Textile Museum you work for is based there. And I was just kind of wondering, how do you feel that this story kind of has shaped the city, and how do you kind of see it still, and how it's shaped the city today, even though, as we mentioned, there's not much production going on anymore?
Yeah. Well, actually, usually I talk about it as a cluster industry, because we had these many different kind of production, mainly knitting, but also other kind of, we also had some weaving, we had some spinning mills, and we had people coming selling machines and needles and yarn. So we had this cluster industry. So it was not only Herning, but also Ikast and Hammerum, small town Hammerum, and Brande, a little south of Herning. So it was this cluster, and it was really important after the Second World War, where we had this huge amount of factories. We had during around 1960, we had 500-600 factories in this area, and it shaped really the area, because we had a lot of people moving into town. During some years in the 60s, we have in average one person moving into Herning every day, and one person moving into Ikast every day. So it was really huge, and it has shaped.
Was it because there were jobs there that they
jobs? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So they textiles or
textiles, yeah. Okay. And they are mostly it was seamstresses that they were looking for, so women to work with sewing machines. So doing different kind of media stunts to make people or women come to this area to work, because they couldn't get enough people to work for them.
So it was really a big boom. Was that in the 1960s?
In the 60s, that was really a rapid growing industry. So when you look at how these towns or cities have been shaped, you can see then we're having areas for the people to work. We have kindergartens, home for elderly people, and all these kind of things growing up in the 60s. And also we had the infrastructure. We have it's based on textile industry, so you're making areas just for textile industry. Before that, it was in the middle of town. For example, my neighbor, she had a small business doing buttons in her cellar. So it was everywhere, but also you started to have, the town was planned to be good for the textile industry. So it was really important. It's kind of what has built this area. That is that we have this really big tradition of textile. And then we had these, when we get into the 80s, and especially the 90s, with the end of the Cold War, we have a period of 15-20 years where there was kind of a depression in the textile industry, because it was getting more and more expensive to do the production in Denmark.
Yeah.
And it was also difficult just to do the outsourcing. It was a new area that you were not used to. So we had these years of transition, and also we had seamstresses losing their jobs and knitters losing their job. And then now today it's a new way. They're dealing with it in a new way. So we have these company headquarters in the area, and then we have the production everywhere
so now it's very much the outsourcing model. So like I know, for example, Bestseller is one of the really big companies. Exactly. They're based in Brande, and most of their production is in Southeast Asia, I believe. But then they still have the design and the HR and the marketing and whatever is still based in Denmark and in around this area. So it's a different kind of job that you're doing now if you're working in that field.
Exactly. Yeah. So depending on how you are accounting, then there's still just as many working in you could say that there's still just as many working in the textile industry today as there was back in the golden days.
You mean in the area, or are you also counting the people abroad?
No, in this area.
In the area. Yeah. Oh, that's
there's
interesting.
Some people, I haven't seen the calculations behind it, but they say that it's still very important for this area and for the economy.
That's interesting, because I was going to have a follow-up question about what happened then after the boom, if then people moved away and then it became this big empty city. But you're saying actually the job's still there, just became office jobs instead.
Exactly, yeah. So instead of being seamstress or knitter, then you'll be designer, working with marketing, and also logistics is really big when you're moving things all around the world. So there's still a lot of people working with it. So my neighbor on the other side, she has a company doing sweaters. So when they are only 3 working in Denmark, and then they have somewhere else with production. So it's still very, very important. But also, I think the textile industry has been very important for the way that the area is thinking, because there was this, we had this period in the 60s where everybody it was like one day you could be a seamstress and the other day you would be a factory owner, because you could just start your own factory, the cellar, and if you're good, then you'll have a really big company within a couple of years. So there's this people very keen on starting up their own business. So the environment is very friendly for businesses, and also the municipality is supporting people who want to start up business. So that's very important for this area, that we have.
So there's very much this entrepreneur spirit.
Yeah, exactly. So it's still there. And also I think it's the municipality knows that it has to be working fast when people come and want to make a new company or a new headquarters somewhere. Then they are always very, very fast, and they are supporting the business, people working with business a lot.
So it's very much a business-minded area. Would you
Exactly.
say that it's also a big part of the identity of how people see themselves in the area, not just with the business, but with the textile tradition? Is it something that people still think in those terms, or has it been translated completely to business in the broader sense? Or is there do you feel like people come to the museum and they're like, textiles, Herning,
No, I think there was this period in the 90s where everything about textile was about people losing their jobs and people moving the factory, and so it was not a very positive story. So I think we've been working a lot on that in the museum to turn it into a meaningful story for people. And also it was something to do with seamstresses having bad backs and necks, and their bodies being being disturbed by all the sewing, because it's hard work. So there was a lot of these not very positive stories about the textile industry, and you have to make sure not to forget the bad stories when you're communicating about the textile industry, but still there was also a lot of positive thing in this this transition, because it was actually a transition that this area went through in a very few years actually.
Yeah. But I noticed one of the things that I thought was really nice about your museum when I came to visit was the fact that you have a lot of volunteers who actually worked in the textile industry themselves. So they're not just trained in the history, they actually lived it.
Yeah.
And I thought that was incredibly interesting. I don't think I've really seen many museums that work in this sort of way before.
No, I think we have, but also it's because it's so close to our own time, I think, because we have a very you can say it's just it's not like the archaeologists who are finding a stone from a very old stone or something like that. We have the people just outside the front door, and we've been doing a lot of effort to kind of involving this local story. And also, like when we do city walks, we very often invite some people with their own stories. So it's also a way of making people talk together about what has been in this area. It's very important to us because it's not that many years ago.
No, so you walk around to different production places or manufacturing places where they used to be?
Yeah. And then they tell their stories, and like it's a way of in one way it's making history alive, but also I think it's a good way to make people think, maybe my story is also important to tell. So that's also one of the ideas behind it. And also that's been a practical thing, because these small companies, like my neighbor with her button factory in the cellar, she didn't have a board writing, having meetings and writing different kind of you can't find archive materials in the same way as you can with big companies, because they always have a lot of written material. So it's also to us a way of getting some source material.
That makes sense. Of course, that's a big difference. But I noticed that you've also been really good at working with like younger designers from sort of my generation that come and do like different workshops, I think, and sort of teach in the museum.
It's in different. We have different ways of doing this. Sometimes it's people coming and they're looking in our boxes with old stuff, and then they find ideas for new products. They can also do exhibitions and do workshops. So it's in many different ways that we try to say, okay, we have these old things. Can we kind of make them renew them and make them important to people today? So that's the main idea. We have it's kind of a big source that you can take from. You can find ideas, and you can see how people did a lot of years ago, and then try to make it appropriate to our life today.
Do you ever work together with like the really big textile college that's nearby, VIA, I think it's called?
We have this. It's very. I think we've done it for. Is it like 6-7 years that we have these? Have a class coming, and we find something from the archives, and then they're doing new products, and then they'll do an exhibition and also sometimes workshops. So that's formalized that we do it. We're not doing it this year because they don't have a class on that study direction this year, but we have it again next year. But I would say it takes some time to find the right way of have this kind of collaboration. So it's in a way that they got something useful for them and we got something useful, because I can see on a knitted stock and think it's very important because it tells about this old tradition going back to the 16th century, and they say it's very boring sock that they can't get any inspiration from. So it's also a question of finding the right kind of old stuff for them. Yeah.
Because there is this really interesting moment in textiles right now, I think, where it's kind of becoming a little more relevant again after having been kind of out of the picture for a while. Like back in the 60s and 70s, it was like a trendy hippie thing, and it was really up in the pop culture. And then in like the 80s and 90s, it became very much a kind of a certain segment of ladies who did it in their spare time, and it was kind of looked down upon a little bit. But it seems as if lately, in like the last 5-10 years, it's kind of becoming trendy again. You're even like seeing these kind of knitting influencers who are doing like their own kind of brand in their name, and then they're selling the recipes for how to knit. And I think it's really interesting how you can see these kind of cycles in history where things come back, and they come back in like a different way than how they were before. So have you felt that there's been more of an interest from a younger audience lately?
It is. There's a. I don't know. We can
sometimes these things, they hit the bigger cities first, and then they kind of spread out towards the rest of the country.
But actually, we just started out last year with a new concept where we are finding. It's been this now it's gloves that we're working with. So we have this group of I think they are 15 knitters, and they come and they look at these gloves and try to reconstruct it and do different kind of experiments. And I think I don't think we could have done this like 10 years ago. We couldn't make these kind of workshops, but now it's very popular to come and join these knitting workshops. And it's not just the people starting up with knitting, it's really hardcore knitters who know how to work with the material and the techniques. So I think
it's really a range of ages of people who come in.
Yeah, but I'll say they are like from 30, 40, 50 years old. Yeah. So it's not the young people.
It's not like the gymnasium.
Not yet.
Give it a few years.
Yeah. I'm sure that they'll come. But I think there's a lot of energy in doing hand techniques at the moment. Yeah.
So. I was actually thinking about it as well when we were talking in the beginning about the hosiery tradition and how you were knitting everywhere you went, and also when you were walking. It's almost like how we are with our smartphones now, I was thinking. People always have them with them. Like, so if you could just replace the smartphone with knitting again, it would be really
true.
insane.
It's true. Yeah. But also these techniques, they are also always embedded in different cultural waves, like in just now with a lot about making things sustainable. And I think that's also part of it now that a lot of people are thinking about sustainability. Then it's more it's slow fashion. It's not fast fashion when you knit it yourself. And
it's having fewer but more meaningful things that seems to become more important, instead of this kind of, we've had almost like a fast food culture for clothing with all the really cheap H&M, Topshop type of brands, where it's kind of shifting now to more expensive brands and making it yourself.
So I think that's part of it. Like in the 70s when they were knitting and weaving, it was more like a critique of, at least in the beginning, it was a critique of the consumption society and the capitalism, and they were doing their own stuff instead of buying things made by seamstresses or made somewhere else in the world by people who were exploited. That's also part of the discussion today. But
I think exactly that's kind of becoming the thing now as well. And there's very much starting to be this sort of anti-capitalist movement that's happening, especially among the younger generation.
Yeah.
I've seen it a lot within the field of climate justice and having these demonstrations to change how we work with the climate change issue. And a lot of these young kids, they're very much anti-capitalist. I'm actually kind of wondering if the next big thing in textiles would become, or I would at least like it if it would become this trend towards repairing, because that's a really good way of not buying things you don't need, is repairing what you already have. But I find that it's something that very few people, especially of the younger generation, have any idea of how to do. Like even for my generation up to like the 40s, a lot of people, if they're not specifically kind of have a hobby of doing textiles or sewing, something like if you lose a button, then people are just I have no idea, how do I get this button back on? It's an impossible task for them. They might even hire someone to put on a button. So it's become this sort of lost craft to have these really quite simple techniques.
Yeah, it's really.
I really hope that's gonna make a comeback soon.
Yeah, well, that's also when I'm comparing the 70s, when there was also a lot of people working knitting and weaving, and then compare with today. At that time, all these girls, they had gone through actually a quite good education during school time, where they've learned to knit, they've learned to sew, so they were able to take it somewhere else and work with the techniques. Today we are like back to scratch, like we're not at all able. So people start to learn how to knit instead of saying, okay, I don't want to do these patterns in the 70s, or like we don't want to do these patterns that companies earn money from. We want to do like the Danish word hønsestrik, where you'll knit just
like a freestyle.
Freestyle and whatever you wanted to do, not being told how to knit and not pay somebody for the patterns. So they took it somewhere else. Today it's more basic that we learn how to knit a sock or how to knit a tablecloth or something like that. So or sew a button on your shirt. So it's a more basic level that we are on today.
Yeah, I wonder how it is today. I remember when I went to school, we didn't learn very much of these techniques, but we did have to take like a driver's license for the sewing machine.
Yeah.
And you got an actual little like sewing machine license. Do you know if they still do that?
I think they still do that, but I think actually, when we're talking about the 70s and these, we want to knit freestyle, and you can see that from we have in our collections, we have from the schools how they teach during the 20th century, and you can see that in the 70s, then they start to do all kind of creative stuff, and you have to use your imagination. So from that time on, people didn't learn the techniques. So maybe so maybe they've learned they've got this sewing machine license, but it's more it's been more about the creativity, which is also in the different techniques you can do with textiles. There's also this creative side but that's been a main focus on that, and that's not so much on the techniques themselves. So I think looking at the schools and how they are educating, that would be a good way to start if you want to really make change with how.
That's really interesting that you have these archives of how the teaching it has changed.
But
it's also definitely my experience that it's the craft that's disappeared. And I remember when I started studying textiles, I just had a teacher who said like, oh, you like colors and you do patterns, you should study textiles now that you're applying for design school. I was like, okay, I'll try that. And had no kind of interest or background in it before. But then when I was introduced to weaving with all the techniques and the fact that you could program it on the computer, I was just like, whoa, I can make something from practically nothing. It was such a fascinating thing. And at that time, it wasn't really something many people were talking about, but I can really feel the cultural shift that's been where today it's almost like a cool thing to say that I'm educated as a weaver, where in the beginning when I was studying it and telling people about it, people were just like, yo, what? That's very strange. Why are you excited? So I really feel like this thing of knowing a craft, that's something that's coming up. And I heard that in the carpentry field of doing furniture, apparently now it's become so popular that they can't take in everybody anymore. Because there's just too many people wanting to study this craft. So you're really having this surge back towards knowing how to make something with your hands. That's happening right now at the same time as you have this digitalization. It's kind of like it's kind of both movements at the same time.
Yeah, I think that when I started, it's 13 years ago, I started at the museum. And when I went to the local design and business school, via design, they're like, oh, we don't want the knitting machines. Everybody have a computer today, and that's it. We got some of the machines and also some weaves because they didn't need it anymore. And today they are learning again how to deal with the machine, how to do a technique. So I think that's very interesting how it's really shifted during these 13 years that we are right now. We're going back a lot to the hand processes and the techniques that you do with your hand. And I think it's like going back and forth. it's always taking these steps from then we are perhaps getting too much into the hand and the techniques, and then it's turning back to the digital. So I think we'll see a lot of shifts when we moving on in time.
Yeah, I actually went to visit that via college a couple of years back, and they were extremely proud to show us this really kind of specialized textile machine area that they had. So it seemed like it was less like the kind of industrial machines and more sort of some of the new things that are happening within the field. And I think that's one of those things that's happening a lot right now. Like you're talking about something like 3D printing and how you can work with that in the field of textiles. That's something that's there's a lot of experiments with right now, but of course it's far from being commercially viable. But then something like if you look at textile print, before it used to be mainly what you call it, with the big rammetryk.
Yes. With it's like silk print or
screen printing. Screen printing. And now it's become commercially viable to mainly do digital printing, where that's only like in the last, I think, 5 years that's really become cheap enough to do that as a main production. Before it was too expensive. So it's just this like huge printer where you put fabric into. So you're seeing the technique itself is like from the consumer, it's the same thing. Whether you have a flower that's screen printed or digital printed, for most consumers, they're not going to notice the difference. But the machines themselves are really different, and they can do really different things. So it makes a really big difference for the designers. So it's just there's some interesting shifts happening.
I also think that when I started here, they had just had this big outsourcing process where they had to learn, okay, how can I control production that is not in the room next to me, it's somewhere else in the world. So they were put a lot of effort into dealing with this distance from design and production. And but then I also think that they realized, okay, or I spoke to a designer who had been in this since 1974 or something like that, and she was like, I could have an idea, or I could come up with a concept, and I could just walk into the room with knitting machines. I could ask the knitter, can you do kind of this, and he'll do a small sample, and then we say, no, maybe a little bit more of this, and the color should be more like that, and then they would do the innovation together. and it's a different process when the machines are in Lithuania or in Turkey. Then you they were if you're only digital and you don't know how the process is at the knitting machine, it can be difficult to know what should I ask them about to get what I want. So I think it's a little they're a little bit going back to the machines, because you have to have knowledge about the machine to be able to say what you want.
Yeah, it's both the thing of having knowledge about what you can do and being able to say what you want, but then there's also the thing of proximity that you mentioned, of being able to test it out. Like when I work with design, that's such an integral part of it. And when I was working in the fashion industry, there was so much money spent on DHLing things back and forth so you could see what things looked like when they were actually made. They had astronomical fees for this because it was just so important. And it sometimes really makes you wonder if it really makes sense to outsource so much of the production, especially when you have these really automated things that doesn't really require so much handwork.
Yeah, and also it's because the fashion industry have this pace. It has to be fast, going back and forth. So it's it could also be an obstruction.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we've more than covered our subject today. It's really good. So thanks so much for taking the time. I think I'll just stop the recording and we can say goodbye to each other in Danish.
Yeah. Yes.
Hang on.